Okay, so we'll now invite my panel for this session to join us on the platform. John Clark, who is Director of International Affairs at DG Agri, Alan Matthews, Professor Emeritus of European Agriculture Policy at Trinity College Dublin, Geoffrey Norn, the Chief Executive of the North Hill Group, also the founder, Ted McKinney, Chief Executive of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, and Marta Zualaga-Zimmerman, Vice President of Government Relations for EAME, EMEA at Cargill. Please come and join me on the platform. Thank you. Wherever you'd like to sit, we won't be prescriptive. Thank you so much, Ted. Thank you. Righto, let's jump right into it, and I really want to create some time here for the audience to jump in as well. Marta, I'm going to start with you. Cargill, sits at the nexus of the global trading system, particularly in relation to agriculture. So, sustainability and productivity, mutually exclusive or completely integrated?
Well, thank you, Mark. That's the million-dollar question that you asked me here. But I'm going to try and really coming from the perspective, indeed, of an international trading company as well as food producer. Of course, I think we've heard from most of the speakers today that we live in a new reality. I think the word perfect storm doesn't even get to describe it. I think we're living really in an imperfect storm environment. What we've seen with the global pandemic and the effects it's had on some of the supply chains, including the food and agriculture supply chains, as well with the geopolitical events and unfolding crisis following the Ukraine's invasion. We have energy crisis. We have at least in Europe and in other regions of the world. We have both inflation, as I mentioned, and of course climate change, with floods and droughts that we're seeing around us and in the world. So I think all of that is increasing volatility and pointing out to this new reality and unprecedented times that we're living. And of course, I think we need to continue to solve again simultaneously three key big challenges, right? Is continue to feed a global growing population. And again, it's not just about food security, but it's also accessibility, it's also affordability that we're looking into, is adapting to the changing climate. And at the end of the day, we also need to continue to produce more sustainably, right? Not to exacerbate that climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think the question is really, so how trade can help? What are the trade-offs? Is trade a conduit to improving those circumstances, those key challenges? So of course, I think, as a company, we sit in the middle of the supply chain, right? And so our job at Cargill is to get food from where it is produced to where it's needed. So we're working with farmers, we work with customers in more than 70 countries around the world where we have production facilities. And really connecting them with markets so that they can respond to those demand signals and really produce for what is needed. And our job is really managing those supply chains and getting the crops out of the field and into the barges, the rail cars, the trucks, and at the end of the day, processing them into our plants, adding value to those products, and producing ingredients and then go to the food, to the feed, and to the industrial markets. And really so that we're able to respond to those customers and ultimately the consumer needs. And I think really as such, we see firsthand how the world food system and basically it's all of it is interconnected, right? And so what is the role that trade can play to ensure that long-term security, food security, and also sustainability? So, for instance, if we look at food security, I think, again, we've all seen the slack that resulted from problems that we suffered on supply chains across the world following the pandemic and also the crisis. But we've also seen how resilient and how adaptable the food systems are to that. And I think, again, in order to be able to continue to respond to these unforeseen events that would continue to happen, we need trade to remain open, because this is what is going to allow us to continue to be able to adapt and to really to provide for the world. So, for instance, I think, just thinking of examples, what can happen? I mean, one of the worst things that can happen for food importing countries in this time of crisis is when exporting countries are imposing barriers, are imposing obstacles, sometimes really to protect their populations, but at the end of the day, the only thing that would do is to exacerbate the crisis by increasing prices and by not allowing the foods to get to where they're needed. I think secondly, if we look at the other problem, which is the adaptation to climate change, indeed, again, we've seen, I live in Belgium, and I've seen the floods last year, the droughts this year in summer. We also see that in the US, with the droughts and what it is happening in the Mississippi River, which is more than half of the grains are going through that highway or waterway. And so the need to adapt, again, to climate change also calls for more open trade rather than less. And then, of course, when we look at sustainability, so I think we know sustainability is one of the presenting issues of our time. But in agriculture and food also in particular, we will not be able to continue to feed the world using the same resources that we've been using so far. So it's about greenhouse gas, it's about the soil health that we've heard about, it's about also the water, the land use. And of course, I think it is not just the farmers that need to take the responsibility. I think as Cargill and sitting again in the middle of supply chain, we take that responsibility seriously on how to reduce the greenhouse gases, the water use, and the land use, etc. And so I think here the role of, and I was mentioned earlier as well, the role of technology, innovation, and innovation. What is the role that can play in really ensuring more sustainable products? And I think trade here is really acting as a conveyor belt. I think I've heard it from one of the speakers earlier as well. Is really allowing that information to go from one place to another, to share those best practices, which is very important, but it's also allowing, as we've heard earlier from the Undersecretary, it's also allowing for markets to be open to farmers and to their farmers that choose to go in this journey and for their products. So, for instance, Cargill has a program on regenerative agriculture, so it's called Regen Connect, and there we're helping farmers exactly to do that, to reduce fertilizer use, to no tillage, and we give compensation, we give incentives to those farmers. We offer verification and also measurement services and technical support, but at the end of the day, we're also trying to find markets that are going to reward those farmers for those practices that they've taken. So all in all, I think trade is very important in ensuring, in allowing basically solving some of these world realities that we've had in the past and now we see even more present today.
Marta, thank you for that. But before I bring in my distinguished colleagues to my right, the no less distinguished colleague, Jeffrey Norn, your perspective on that, from what you heard from Marta and others already this afternoon, you see trade as a facilitator of sustainability as well as productivity?
So I guess my perspective on this is from the vantage point of a regulatory practitioner. Just for some context, my firm works with biotech and gene editing companies to develop products that are more sustainable, be they plants or animals. We assemble the technical information and write the dossiers that bring products through complex regulatory systems around the world. What we have observed over the last several years is that due to the pace of innovation in agriculture, that trade policy regimes, environmental risk assessments and food safety risk assessments, all these systems are struggling to keep up with the pace of innovation. And when I say innovation, I'm not talking about from big multinational companies. I'm talking about things that are happening in small companies that are using new genetic editing techniques such as CRISPR-Cas9. So, for example, there's a UK-based company that we work with that is developing bananas that are resistant to two of the most important banana diseases, and that's black sigatoka and tropical race 4. If these diseases aren't addressed in the next 30 years, the Cavendish banana as we know it today will no longer exist. We work with genetics companies that are developing livestock that's resistant to disease. And then if you believe, as I do, that humane labor practices are a part of sustainability, There's a company in North Carolina that is developing thornless blackberry bushes. And that's because blackberries are harvested by hand, and it's very labor-intensive and dangerous work, and often done by women. And so a thornless blackberry bush gives you a solution that is more more productive and safer for workers, which is important. But what you find in agricultural innovation firms is that we go where we're loved. And right now, that's not Europe. So countries like Guatemala, and Honduras, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Japan, and the Philippines have all managed to put in place regulatory systems for gene-edited products that are workable. And risk assessors in those countries have managed to make regulatory determinations in a matter of weeks and months, not years, and for costs that are pretty reasonable. So this, sort of asynchronous adoption and disharmonized regulatory system becomes rather complicated when the issue of trade comes up, because the European Union sources products from all over the world. So I guess, without harmonized systems, or at least a common goal, what we will see is that the gains from new technologies will be lost and foregone. And the costs of those will be largely disproportionately borne by farmers in the developing world. So, kind of to wrap it up, I guess for me, these questions are not theoretical or academic. These are conversations that happen in companies all over the world on a daily basis. And the key question is not, can we make agricultural products more sustainable? The key question is, can we sell those products once we do?
Thank you for the perspective, Jeffrey. I'm going to give John Clark the opportunity to have first response to that. John, similar question to you. Trade, it can be an enabling policy. Jeffrey's talked about the regulatory system that sits around it and asynchronous approvals. Do you think that's a fair charge against the European Union in terms of what Europe's done? Well,
this is a very difficult question to answer in 2 minutes. I'm reminded of that Monty Python sketch where quiz show contestants are asked to summarize the works of Marcel Proust in 15 seconds. So you're asking me to do the equivalent of summarizing Proust in 15 seconds. No, more seriously, no. Of course, I don't accept that premise, which I don't think actually was being made. More fundamentally, I don't buy the argument, first of all, that there is a trade-off between sustainability and productivity. I don't even think there is a balance to be struck. The two are and must be mutually reinforcing, for the very simple reason that if we don't produce sustainably our agriculture and food, at the end of the day, we will have no soil left. We'll have polluted water. The air will be polluted. And in many sectors, in many parts of the world, we're already at a tipping point when it comes to that. So for me, it's very, very clear that sustainability and productivity do go hand in hand and are mutually reinforcing. Now, when it comes to the trade agenda, in general, I would agree with my head of cabinet that, by and large, open trade is probably conducive to more sustainable production methods, given the workings of comparative advantage. It makes no sense for the European Union, for example, to get rid of all its wheat fields and plant soya, or for the USA to get rid of all its soybean production and plant, olive trees in the Midwest. We each play to our strengths, and it's far more productive and a more efficient and effective and use of limited land to produce what we're best at producing. So and being able to then trade that across the Atlantic or globally. So by and large, I would agree that open trade tends to be conducive to more sustainability, but it's not automatic. And countries who are trading and producing need to put in place explicit, deliberate policies to make their production more sustainable, as we are trying to do in the European Union.
John, thanks for that. I'm just going to pass it to Alan before I bring in Ted. I mean, Alan, there you go, we've got an abundance of microphones here, which is always good. Alan, you've studied this over decades. What's your perspective on what you've heard in terms of the different parts of the discussion we just started to have on the panel here?
I think both of the keynote speakers emphasized the importance of sustainable trade. And I guess for me, that really means facilitating trade in sustainable products. And although I, of course, agree that open trade has many advantages, I think there is a case for limiting access to our market for products which are clearly unsustainable, particularly when we take into account global environmental goods. These can be unsustainable in environmental terms. They can also be unsustainable in terms of, for example, the One Health agenda, if we think of antimicrobial resistance. And there also can be, I think, important ethical guidelines that should be met in terms of the goods that we trade and we import. Of course, you could argue that in a sort of market economy, we should simply leave it up to consumers to decide. And you know, we put sustainability labels on products and leave it up to the market. But most governments accept that the sort of negative externalities of unsustainability are so great that we need to actually regulate. And the problem for international trade is where national regulations differ. And I think that was also the issue that you were highlighting. So what can be done in those circumstances? It's important to make the point, I think, that it's not necessary that regulations be the same everywhere. The European Union is a high standard food producer. We have raised those standards over the last 2 to 3 decades, and yet at the same time, we have actually increased our net agricultural exports. There's no trade-off, as John has suggested. And there's good reasons why we might expect those kind of positive feedbacks. But nonetheless, the regulatory differences do create problems for international trade. But we can see that cooperation particularly between the US and the EU, is really important here. If we take, for example, the issue of trying to end tropical deforestation, both the EU and the US are members of the FACT dialogue. That's the Food, Agriculture and Commodities Trade Dialogue that was set up at Glasgow last year, co-chaired by the UK and Indonesia, brings together the major producer and consuming countries of timber, and which tries to induce, if you like, through better understanding, through voluntary guidelines, to try to bring an end to tropical deforestation, while at the same time promoting sustainable trade and development. The EU, of course, has gone further. The Commission has proposed this deforestation-free supply chain directive. But I also noticed reports in the US that the administration there may be considering the use of the Magnitsky Act and sanctions against large deforesters, for example, in Latin America. So there's a lot of similarity. And I was struck by a really interesting proposal that the US put to the WTO in December of 2020. I don't know whether it's still administration policy, Jason, or not, but this was a proposal for a ministerial declaration at the WTO, which would essentially say that if a country had weak or unenforced environmental standards, that was, in a sense, an implicit subsidy to their producers. And this was, if you like, unfair in terms of comparative advantage, and it could justify the use of countervailing duties if a country was not enforcing fundamental standards. And of course, the question is, who decides those standards? And that seems to me the question that's important to address. The EU, it's clearly not the WTO. That's not a standard-setting body. The EU is proposing that the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is the body that sets food standards, but mainly in the health and hygiene area, that should be, its mandate should be extended to also include sustainability issues. But as I understand it, at the executive meeting last month, that EU proposal was met pretty coldly by other members. But if we are going to try to achieve, if you like, this regulatory cooperation, we do need to have an institution where we can discuss these sustainability standards.
Alan, thank you very much. Ted, last but not least, your perspective, sir.
Well, there's a lot of red meat there. Alan, we have not had a chance to meet, but anybody with Trinity College has my deep respect, so thank you for those comments. Well, let me start out with the obvious. There is a lot of collaboration between the EU and the US, and I think we could extend that to other countries, Canada or some of our North American colleagues, and that's a great thing. There's not very much at all good that's come from this entire fiasco with Russia and Ukraine, and I got to compliment the tide, Jason. You're true to the cause. But the only good thing, or at least one of the very, very few good things, is that it's drawn our regions together, and I do celebrate that. And Mark, I think what you and the Forum for the Future of Ag, your FFA, is doing here, we have got to continue. In fact, I hearken back to when you came and visited us in a former life of mine, and we had this discussion, and gosh, look where you've taken this, so my compliments. We have a lot in common, but I think it's time we stop saying that we have so much that binds us that we must just overlook some of the smaller things. No, this is building to a head, and I'm speaking of ag in the U.S. and other parts of the world. The U.S. is not alone in this. And some of the European policies, and I'm really getting at some of the things that get at the precautionary principle and some of the things like that. There is a very wide chasm that seems to be getting wider. And I think it's coming to a head, quite frankly. Let me give you an example. One of the reasons I wanted to come here on our own nickel, nobody's providing this, is because of at least a couple elements of Farm to Fork, the Green Deal. Now, let me say as a compliment, the objectives of the Green Deal are ones that I would have written. I am highly complimentary, and I say that to everyone I visit with. Some, not all of the tactics, in our view, and I think the view of many around the world, and I've had calls. I have not outbound calls. I have received calls from Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and I know the pressure being brought on the EU at the WTO on some of these things cannot stand the pale. The plan to eliminate 50% of the global MRL ban is going to drastically harm the environment and farmers alike. Our USDA Economic Research Service did a study. By the way, they're an independent group. Nobody influences them. They go gather their own data. And their data is almost always that from USDA, but it pulls from all of the data that countries provide to my alma mater at Purdue University. I forget that model. GTAP. Thank you, the GTAP model. So it's using the data of Europe and European countries. And it showed that depending on how far Farm to Fork goes with some of its things, it most certainly harms your farmers, the EU farmers, but because of your policy that you're not going to do harm to your farmers, I get the politics of that, you start to harm me. Let me give you an example. Our own family farm is down 16% in the fertilizer usage, down 20% in pesticide use, not because of heavy-handed regulations, but because it was the wise thing to do, and we had the technologies and the critical mass to use variable rate technology in those fertilizers. We have adopted biotech. We fought through 2 years of fall armyworm, and if you don't know fall armyworm, it's a nasty critter decimating Europe, decimating China, and perhaps other places. And if farm to fork passes, and if some of the key products, and I'll just name them, glyphosate, perhaps glufosinate, atrazine, simazine, if those are eliminated, then I have a choice. I either continue to be able to sell to Europe and eliminate all those and go back to disc and a field cultivator 2 or 3 trips across the field, which means all kinds of greenhouse gases emit, or I no longer sell to Europe. And I don't understand that because we raise seed soybeans for a couple of companies, and we've already gotten your wonderful moniker endorsing sustainably produced soybeans. Last time I checked, that our friends in Brazil do not have that. We still have concerns. Some of it's unknown, some of it's alleged, but there's some concerns about the Amazon. So we still wonder, why are most of the soybeans being purchased from Brazil? So from my standpoint, I'm confused, but I do think, I love Europe. I love the Europeans. My heritage is there. I love the folks. And John, we've been on the other side of different discussions on this, but I believe firmly if some elements, not all, but if some elements of farm to fork advance, it will be a dramatic deterrent to trade generally, which brings great benefits to the world. And I think it's going to very seriously damage what I think is a great and growing relationship between our country and many others and that of Europe. So let's work together on the things that we can work together on. I agree, but let's really face down these very, very difficult things that I think are going to have a very detrimental effect on climate and farmers in both our countries.
Ted, thank you very much. I don't know if you want to respond to that, John, but before you do, I'm going to be a little bit naughty and say you and I were part of a discussion
Absolutely.
Earlier on today where you heard a perspective, particularly from the European Parliament, about where farm to fork came from, where it is and where it's going. Did that reassure you at all?
It did a bit. The discussion, first, some terrific people. And I hope I qualified that some of the early impressions have changed. And I did hear that. And I've got to dive more deeply. I know some of those. For example, I was very, very concerned about the tendency toward no or zero or almost no antibiotic use. We're in complete agreement that you cannot use and should not use antibiotics for growth promotion. That was taken off the label. I was a part of that movement in the company I worked for back in the day. Complete agreement there. But I think early on there was some misinformation, incorrect information. Maybe it was a lack of clarity as the whole project was emerging about none, zero, not at all. So there, I was comforted some, and my challenge is to go back and understand more of those. But I think I also got confirmation that some of my biggest concerns are still very much at the fore.
Yeah. Some of what we were talking about at lunch, John, was about mindset, and part of what certainly we've tried to do at the forum and what has now been taken on at a more institutional level is try to build that understanding so that the space for misunderstanding is minimized. That was part of our discussion at lunchtime, and on that basis, I do just want to give you the opportunity to respond to whatever you heard from Ted, if you'd like to.
Oh, I'm not sure if I'd like to, but I will. And I noticed that we are called respondents, as if we're in a divorce hearing. I hope that's not the case, Ted. Yeah.
Friends, John.
We are friends, and friends can always disagree, and I do disagree with some of the things you've said. I think it's incumbent on us to explain better, perhaps, what the farm to fork strategy is actually about and what it's not about. We clearly have not done that adequately, because I think if we can do that, we can assuage most of your concerns. I'll make 2 points. One is one should not orientate your views or policy based on the USDA study that you cited. Like all economic models, it was very selective, very limited in what it can mathematically do. It did not take into account the fact that food waste reduction is going to be a very, very important aspect of the farm to fork strategy. This was discussed earlier today. If we can halve food waste in Europe, that more than compensates for the loss of exports from Ukraine, for cereals, for example. very, very important. The study cannot model the impact of research, innovation, and science and technology, which will have a very, very profound impact on our productivity. And it does not and could not factor in changes in consumer behavior and preferences. And we expect European consumers and consumers outside Europe in the longer term to move more towards plant-based proteins, which are a much more efficient way of using every hectare, or in your case, acre of land. So this famous study has some inherent limitations. The second point I would make is that we really have no alternative to reducing harmful pesticide use, reducing residue limits for environmental and health reasons, and for moving more towards organic production, which is much more kind on the environment and the climate. If we don't move in this direction, we're going to be completely wrecked in the long term. Now, you may say, well, you may quote Maynard Keynes, in the long term we're all dead, but we're not dead yet, and the protection of the environment and the climate, it reminds me of the famous quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry: "We don't inherit the earth; we are borrowing it from our grandchildren." And that is the motivation behind the Farm to Fork strategy and the Green Deal. And honestly, I do not think there is an alternative but to try to meet those targets. You share the same basic objectives, which is a more climate-friendly agriculture, reaching climate neutrality by 2050. We differ in some ways in the way that we want to achieve those targets, but I think our approach is perfectly legitimate and is based on science and is not protectionist and is not discriminatory. So, we are, if you like, coming back to the non-divorce metaphor, we are having different dreams, but we are sleeping in the same bed.
I have to say, John, I've never been more relieved to find that we haven't got a Freudian slip on the screen that doesn't say defendants rather than respondents. Ted, go on, and then I want to bring the audience in if I can do.
Well, I think you said it. We're going to have to agree to disagree. I know what that policy is going to do to my farm. And my farm is not very different from Canada, so many farms in the US, Brazil, Argentina. So I too laud the EU leadership on the objectives. I do. But I hope, and I hate to say this for the sake of the farmers in Europe, who I understand are complaining about some of this, that if you feel like that's right for Europe, then impose that on Europe. But don't impose it on the rest of the world, where we are very much into finding and growing the proteins to feed the world. Because most certainly, and by the way, I helped set up a lot of farmers in my Indiana role under then Governor Pence, a lot of organic farmers. I'm very proud of the organic movement. This is not an anti-organic, but if we move toward organic production in the manner that at least I'm sensing directionally, we most certainly will not have the foods that we need. So, John, you're my friend, and I appreciate that, but boy, we are certainly on opposite ends of this whole thing. I just want to say there is so much we can do together, but we have got to face these hard facts, because these are going to boil to a head, and they are now, and it's not going to be pretty.
So I'm hoping that during the course of this evening and this week that some of the reassurance that you had at lunchtime will be built on, and that John has the opportunity to assuage you of your concerns.
I welcome that. I'll buy you a drink, John.
Very good. I don't know why I volunteered to moderate this session. Questions from the audience. Pedro Gallardo from Asaja. Do speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Let me to ask the question. Well, my name is Pedro Gallardo. I'm farmer in Spain, fourth-generation farmer. I represent Asaja farmers, Cádiz, in this meeting. Okay, I would like to talk about the Green Deal. because we, like farmers, we are waiting for impact assessment that we didn't solve. We have I would like to thank United States Department of Agriculture for the impact assessment, because this impact assessment said we are going to produce 15% less with the farm to fork. We hear a lot about farm to fork, but I think it's focused on the fork, because we don't see the farm anywhere, at least our perception. I think this means to have limitation to the production, limitation in phytosanitary, limitation in fertilizer, and I think at the end we are going to produce to be a green island in the world, but not productivity. We will bring everything from outside of Europe, because if we continue with that, we don't know what to produce, and of course we totally disagree about the implementation. Why 50%? Why not 30? Why not 60? Why? We don't have the study. We don't have the answer for that. And of course, we refuse the Green Deal. In fact, our organization, we refuse the plan strategic in Spain, because, for example, the eco-scheme are going to represent 25% of the budget. Okay, we are going to do, because it's 20% of the budget. If the eco-scheme will be 50%, no farmer will make eco-scheme. The only reason is that there is a huge budget for that. Then we saw that. I have one more question.
Might just have to rush you, yes. Pedro, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Final question. This morning, this afternoon, we see about motivation. In Spain, we have lost half of the farmers in the last 14 years, from 1 to 2 million. Now we have 600,000 farmers in just 14 years. If we continue with that, we are going to disappear, because we want to produce, and we have limitation. And of course, I think that the final question.
I did say one.
we need tools. We need tools to produce. Now in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, we have a drought season. Yeah. We need tools. We need seed adapted to the climate change, because we want to produce. The new breeding technology is a key for that. And we need tools. If we have tools, we can produce. But we can make a sustainable farming if we don't have tools. And we miss tools, real tools, because many alternatives are not real alternatives when we try in the field. Thank you.
Pedro, wonderful to see you, and thank you for that. Would you mind passing the microphone to, sir, do introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I have only one question. My name is Jaime Picara. I represent the FIFAC, European Feed Industry Federation, and we worried about the deforestation proposal you mentioned in this afternoon several times. So my question is more or less simple. It's complicated, I know. I don't know any impact assessment on that, the proposal, but what, in your opinion, maybe John or Marta, what can be the impact, first one, on the role of European role on the global market, and also for the food security issue?
Okay,
thank you.
Very good. Can I just get an indication of anyone else who wants to ask questions before we close? Okay, I will give you one more opportunity. So, John, first of all, I'll give you the opportunity. I don't know if Mache wants to help as well, in response to Pedro. You pass John a microphone. Thank you.
It's always the role of the European Commission to be the kind of the whipping boy for all of the problems of the world. But no, to the colleague from Spain, the Spanish farmer, I would have thought that given the very high degree of desertification that Spain has experienced in recent years, the impact of climate change on Spanish agriculture, it makes the Green Deal more fundamentally necessary than ever. Without a policy to manage climate change, to mitigate it, to reach carbon neutrality, the process of desertification in Spain, it will just march on inexorably, and you'll have no agriculture left at all in 20 years. So it completely flabbergasts me that you would be against the objectives of the Green Deal, which are aimed at actually preserving a temperate climate and agricultural production in countries like Spain, which have suffered from climate change and extreme weather events for the last few years, and which has been one of the main reasons for rural depopulation. Now I've forgotten what the other question was. The deforestation regulation. What is the? Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not shy about answering any question, but I think it would be more useful to give other members of the panel the chance to speak. Yeah?
Yeah, Marta, do you want to pick that up?
Okay, I can take it from my perspective, of course, not being the European Commission, but an operator that is indeed involved in trading commodities from many countries into the EU. And I think deforestation or the fight against deforestation is a shared objective for all. I think it's both for countries, for companies, for farmers. So I think, I mean, as a company, we've enhanced transparency and really in agriculture supply chains and tackling issues such as this one has been a priority for a company for many years. So we're finding ways in working with civil society, NGOs, and farmers. I mean, in those producing countries, to give incentives to produce differently and as well to combat deforestation. Of course, I think, I mean, both as company as well as industry, we've promoted as well both the use of voluntary systems, but also mandatory in a way, through rules and regulations that to help us get there. So I think that's really more the key point, Jaime, that I think you were mentioning, is how to make it operationally feasible to achieve those goals that are shared by all. And I think that's where as industry, we're working with colleagues, rest of the industry, as well as with the decision makers in the European Union, is how to make it conducive to that end goal of fighting deforestation, rather than just cutting supplies and disengage. So I think here work of the government-to-government discussion, as well as with operators, with other supply chain partners in giving incentives and increasing that capacity in origin countries continues to be key. And those partnerships will need to be key with the regulation and after its implementation as well.
Marta, thank you. I think Maciej, can we pass your microphone to Maciej? Thank you.
Very quick ad lib to what John said, and I absolutely agree with him, but to our Spanish colleague, the question we have to ask ourselves, do you really see the goals of the farm to fork, the ones that are enshrined in the strategy, reflected in your strategic national plan, CAP strategic plan? You probably don't. There's a reason for it. None of the CAP strategic plans in none of the member states have targets and goals that are found in the farm to fork strategy or biodiversity strategy. Why is it? It is because biodiversity and farm to fork strategies are strategies. They're not legislative documents. They're aspirational goals, they're political goals. That's why my commissioner took pains to ensure that in CAP strategic plans, every member state had a chance to tailor them to the specific circumstances of their farming structures and environment, etc. So that's one important point. Point me just one CAP strategic plan where you have one-to-one representation of farm to fork target in the CAP strategic plan. It just does not exist. Now, if you read farm to fork strategy very carefully, and it was also because of my commissioner's work, you'll see that, one, every goal will have to take into account differences in starting points of member states. That's one. So we have to take into account diversity of agriculture EU when we implement farm to fork. That's one. If it doesn't work, for example, people criticize the pesticides proposal that was drafted, we have the whole legislative process where this proposal is now going through certain modifications, and I'm sure you'll see the spectrum of pesticide reductions broadened to what came out of the Commission proposal. So if you also read farm to fork very carefully, you also see that if any of the targets will, in a substantive sense, endanger income and profitability of farmers, there's a possibility of review. So there are a lot of safeguards in that political document also that point in the direction these are not things set in stone as if some sort of a mosaic tablet of the Ten Commandments. So I assure you that my commissioner took great pain to ensure that CAP strategic plans of each member state is really tailored to the circumstances of each country. Thank you.
Maciej, thank you very much indeed for that. It was part of the discussion that I was referring to with Ted earlier that happened over lunch, that part of this is about trying to build understanding between the US and EU in terms of where things are coming from. And the point you made, Maciej, about Farm to Fork being a strategy, not a legal instrument, I think is an important one for all of us to consider within the room. So thank you for that. I'm aware that the clock has just about beaten us. I do want to just ask Jeffrey or Alan if you've got any final comments that you'd like to make from what you've heard. Maybe Jeffrey first, and then Alan.
I don't know if this is. Lucas started off this session with a quote from Mark Twain, and it reminded me of another quote from Mark Twain that was something like, "There's nothing sadder than a young pessimist other than an old optimist." And what I guess I'm heartened by is that while there are differences on some policy issues, I think that there are shared goals, and that despite our ages, we're optimistic about the future of the relationship in general. I guess that's all I would say.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that. Alan, anything from you?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good note to end on.
Tremendous. Thank you. I'm just going to ask Alan Dominique Cantar in a second from Syngenta, one of our founding partners, to say some closing words. I don't think he's got the enviable task of trying to summarize everything he's heard. But just before we do, please give a warm round of applause to our panelists.